I'd like to start this evening by welcoming you all to this wonderful opportunity, the first in our annual series of the Dean's Lectures for 2015. This is, of course, if you come to the right place, a wonderful lecture by Professor Neil Brenner, who is going to speak to us about the urban age in question. My name is Tom Cavan. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here at the University of Melbourne, and it's my real pleasure to open this evening's lecture. I begin the lecture this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and I pay respect to their elders and families past and present. As I mentioned, this is the first of the 2015 Dean's Lecture Series, and you can see the other speakers above me at the moment. And it's a real pleasure to start this series with such an important and relevant topic to life in the 21st century. Questions of urbanization are a theme of many of these Dean's Lectures over recent years, and increasingly, too, this university has engaged in such questions not only through the expected channels of urban planning and design and development, but also through the larger questions of governance, equity, health, cultures, and economies. Urban places are complex places. So through our research and teaching practices here, we demonstrate that these questions are neither the privilege of one discipline, nor the burden of one faculty. In developing our cross-disciplinary behaviors across our university, we're substantially engaged in the complexities of realizing and exploring our futures. So I'm very pleased to see here in the audience today so many of my distinguished colleagues from across the university who work on these questions. In particular here in the Australasian region, where the pressing issues of sustainability, globalization, and climate change need to be considered in relation to the urban condition, from the macro to the micro, it's a privilege to host Professor Brenner from here at the Melbourne School of Design. Neil Brenner is Professor of Urban Theory and Director of the Urban Theory Lab at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, a research team dedicated to rethinking the basic categories, methods, and cartographies of urban theory. For over a decade, he's been considered one of the world's leading professors in critical urban theory globally. He's described himself as an urban political sociologist, a state theorist, and a sociospatial theorist. Developing on his background, his educational background in philosophy, urban geography, and political science, you can appreciate the perspective and depth that he brings to this critical topic. And also, having earned degrees in Yale, Chicago, and UCLA, you can see the intellectual heritage that he brings to this discussion that will follow. So his most recently published book is the edited volume, Implosions, Explosions, Towards a Study of Planetary Urbanization, which elaborates the conceptual foundations for the ongoing work of the Urban Theory Lab in contemporary forms of urbanization. And we're extremely privileged this evening to hear of the latest developments. And I encourage you to go upstairs to the Andrew Lee King Fund Gallery, which is on the diagonal opposite corner of this building, where there's a fascinating and engaging exhibition of the work coming out of the Urban Theory Lab. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Neil Brenner.
So is the sound on? Yes. So Tom, thank you so much for the generous introduction. And thanks to everyone for such a warm and friendly greeting in Melbourne. It's really a pleasure to be here. A few thank yous, actually. So thanks to my friend and colleague, Brendan Gleeson, for intellectual dialogue and critical engagement. Brendan and I have been in dialogue for quite a while now. He's actually got a chapter in the Implosions, Explosions book that was just mentioned, but this is the first time that we've actually met in person, and we've had a wonderful set of dialogues, which I think will continue into the future. I also just really want to thank the absolutely wonderful team here at the Melbourne School of Design for giving just really incredible logistical and organizational support related to my visit and related to the exhibition, particularly Philippa Knack, who's just done an absolutely tremendous job. We've been in email contact so many times a day for many weeks now, so it's wonderful to be here. There she is. So Philippa, thank you so much. And also thank you to Reese Quilford and James Rafferty for all kinds of assistance with video and communications aspects. So obviously we have an exhibition that has gone up, and I'll be talking about the intellectual framework and backstory behind the exhibition. I want to emphasize that the work in the exhibition is really part of a collective project, and I'll talk more about that collective project. I direct the Urban Theory Lab at the GSD. I'll be explaining a little bit about what our work is, but this exhibition really puts on display work that's been ongoing for about 3 years by doctoral students in the Doctor of Design Studies program at the GSD, and particularly students in some of the MDes, the Master of Design Studies programs at the GSD, a very interesting set of post-professional degree programs in a variety of different fields. And so this is very much the product of our collaboration, and particular thanks to the curatorial team in the Urban Theory Lab, which did really a prodigious amount of effort to pull together the different materials in the exhibition. Danny Ibanez, Chris Bennett, Gerga Basic, and Mariano Gomez-Luke. Final word of thank you. Much of the work that I'm presenting on tonight is part of an intellectual dialogue with Professor Christian Schmid of the ETH in Zurich. We've written a few articles together. We're in the process of writing a short book on planetary urbanization. So this is very much a collective project in several different registers. And before I go into the content of the lecture, one other announcement related to the exhibition, which is very important. So we really hope, particularly after hearing the lecture, that you can stop into the gallery and have a look at the work that we're doing. I'll talk about the content of the exhibition in this lecture towards the very end. This is really like the intellectual framework that animates the work that we're doing in the exhibition. But I really want to have the opportunity to have maybe smaller dialogues with people in the community here about the work that we did in the exhibition. So this Friday at 3 p.m., I believe until 5, we're going to have what we're calling a salon in the gallery. And I'm basically just going to hang out there, and whoever comes and wants to have a look and dialogue with me, and we can just brainstorm about it. It's very experimental work, as I will explain. But if you're free Friday afternoon, then please do stop by anytime between 3 and 5. And we'll hopefully get some dialogues going. Hopefully some dialogues can happen, obviously, even in my absence, but we wanted to make that possible. So, okay, great. So, as has been mentioned, my work is in the field of urban theory, which basically, in a nutshell, I think of urban theory as the attempt to critically clarify the basic concepts, categories, interpretations that we use to think about and to influence urban questions. So in this sense, urban theory is all around us all the time. To the degree that we're concerned about cities and urbanization, we're always already engaged in urban theory because we're presupposing different interpretations of what cities are and what urbanization is. So critical urban theory is an attempt to critically engage with and clarify some of those dominant interpretations of urban processes and urban questions. So the basic question of urban theory, as I understand it, is how to understand urban life. And that raises any number of subsidiary questions that we have to engage with, whether we are scholars studying urbanization processes or practitioners engaging with any aspect of the built environment. So clearly, I think that urban theory is quite relevant not only to research, but also to every realm of practice. That's an argument I'm constantly making to my students and colleagues at the GSD and elsewhere, and it's definitely an argument that I'll be elaborating here. Now, urban theory today is in a somewhat paradoxical condition from my point of view. On the one hand, there's massive disagreement within the field. It's a very lively field because unlike fields where there's a dominant paradigm that's basically presupposed by most practitioners and then it's used to generate research, in the field of urban theory today, there's massive disagreement about almost anything imaginable. What is the urban? What methods should we use to study the urban, to influence the urban, etc. So this disagreement makes it a very lively field to work in, and we have a lot of fun working in it. But at the same time, and this is really the concern that animates a lot of my work and animates the arguments I'll be making tonight, the field, I would argue, is marked very strongly by the legacies of really the last 100 years. So certain assumptions, despite all the effervescent disagreement about so many issues, the field still presupposes, I would argue, certain underlying spatial taxonomies that are really derived from the period of capitalist development in which the field emerged, late 19th century, early 20th century. Specifically, what I have in mind is the notion that the world is divided between urban and non-urban space. So sometimes the rural is used. So the urban-rural divide, sometimes the urban, the suburban, the rural, and the wilderness, but a kind of typologization of settlement space with the urban representing a specific type of space. So in a nutshell, the notion that the city or the urban is a particular type of space that should be studied according to its own particular principles and its own particular categories. That assumption, whatever disagreements we have about urban questions and methods today, continues, I would argue, to be constitutive in some ways, epistemologically constitutive for thought and for action in relation to urban questions. So when I moved to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard a couple years ago, we set up the Urban Theory Lab, which was precisely, and is precisely, an attempt to critically engage with underlying assumptions about spatial organization that inform research and action on urban questions, and to raise the question of whether actually we need to reinvent our most basic categories of analysis in order to deal with rapidly changing social, economic, environmental, spatial conditions. So this is the first page of our website, which we hope you'll have a look at. And this basically lays out, in some ways, the problematique, the set of questions, the set of agendas that animates so much of our work. As scholars struggle to decipher current forms of urbanization, they are forced, we would argue, to confront the limitations of inherited approaches to urban questions, and consequently to confront the difficult challenge of inventing new theories, concepts, methods, and cartographies that may better illuminate emergent spatial conditions. So this question of reinventing categories and cartographies in relation to changing conditions, that's the heart of our project. That's the heart of what I'm going to talk about tonight. That's the heart of what the exhibition is all about. So the notion of an urban theory lab may seem a little counterintuitive. Usually the notion of a laboratory, and rightly so, refers to a set of researchers who are engaged in very empirically oriented research, testing hypotheses, gathering evidence, and so forth. Now, we're very interested in concrete research. It's fundamental. But what drives our work is not simply the investigation of particular conditions and transformations, as important as that is, but rather what drives it, what animates it, what motivates it, is the attempt to generate these new categories. And in the social sciences, particularly with the continued dominance of positivism as the model that underpins so-called scientific inquiry, theory is often dismissed or marginalized as being irrelevant. So this is a strong kind of counterpoint to that sort of positivist epistemology, which suggests that theory is actually as important to advancing knowledge and also advancing our ability to influence the world as the process of gathering evidence. There's obviously a dialectic between concrete research and abstract theorization. So again, the point for us is not that we diminish the importance of concrete research, but rather what drives the concrete research endeavors that we're engaged in, such as those that are on display in the exhibition, is the attempt to develop new categories, new interpretations, and new cartographies. A new cognitive map, we might say, of urbanization processes. So a quick overview of some of our many agendas that we're developing in the lab. So we're interested in the legacies of urban theory. I've already suggested that we have a very critical orientation towards some aspects of the inheritance of urban theory during the last 100 years. But it's very interesting from the point of view of our concerns with planetary urbanization to reread certain canonical works as well as certain subterranean strands of urban theory that acquire new meaning in the context of early 21st century capitalism. Whether it's Lewis Wirth or other representatives of the Chicago School, whether it's more territorially oriented urbanists such as Jean Gottman or Konstantinos Doxiadis and others, it's fundamental to continue to critically interrogate the legacies of 20th century urbanization, even as we try to blast forward and develop new concepts. I've been rereading a lot of Lewis Mumford from the 1920s during the last year or so, and it's extraordinary to read Mumford on environmental transformation and urbanization in the context of some of our concerns about early 21st century urbanization. Just as importantly to our work, and this is really the focus of what I'll talk about tonight, We want to critically interrogate some of the dominant meta-narratives, the dominant interpretations of contemporary urbanization. It's widely claimed that we live in an urban world and that urban conditions are central to concerns that we have with society, economy, environment, and so forth. There are many different strands of global urban discourse, and we're very interested in critically examining such interpretations as a springboard into some of the alternatives that we're developing. In this context, I strongly recommend Brendan Gleeson's latest book, The Urban Condition, which provides a wonderful critical interrogation of some of these same kind of discussions about the global urban condition. We're very interested, as you'll see in the exhibition, in the relationship between developing theory and visualization, cartography. On the one side, we want to try to develop visualizations, cognitive maps of dominant traditions of urban theory. But at the same time, and this is really front and center in the exhibition, we want to use visualization as a tool for developing new theoretical understandings. So this is something I never could do on my own, precisely because I'm lucky enough to collaborate with wonderful, creative, critical designers and cartographers working together. We're trying to do this, to explore this interface between the map and the concept, between theorization and visualization. Again, the critical priority in all of this, and there are many different research projects that are intertwined with each of these layers or each of these points, the underlying agenda in all of these contexts is to ask the question of whether we can develop new conceptualizations, new interpretations, new cartographies to inform research and practice on contemporary urban life. So to give you, as it were, a preview of the kind of main argument that I'm making in this lecture, in a lot of the work that I'm doing with Christian Schmid, and in my collaborations with the Urban Theory Lab, here's the kind of quick summary, which I'll then elaborate in more detail during the time allotted. I realized I didn't start my stopwatch, which I always do, so I'm going to assume I've been talking for about 10 minutes and now hit my stopwatch. So don't despair. After an hour, I will somehow land the plane that is still in the process of taking off. So I've already explained this argument at the outset that the major traditions of contemporary urban theory continue, whatever disagreements they have, to define the urban as a type of settlement space that's contrasted to a non-urban rural outside. So our work is trying to move beyond that emphasis on agglomerations and particular settlement types to look at the relationship between agglomeration processes, the relationship between cities and what we call operational landscapes. So broader social, territorial, landscape, and environmental transformations which occur precisely in support of city growth. So the direction we're going with this is to start to include what's often referred to as the hinterland or the rural or the wilderness even within the urban problematique, and to look at the ways in which it's actually these zones that are supposedly outside according to our dominant categories are actually being progressively integrated into a worldwide urban fabric, oftentimes with deeply destructive social and environmental consequences. So the standard model of the urban as a settlement type will be familiar to many of you from this classic dartboard model from Ernest Burgess in the 1920s in the Chicago School, but even contemporary debates on global cities, which focus on interurban networks. This is, of course, from John Friedman's classic 1986 piece on world city formation. Most of the world is outside of the urban. You have some dots, which are the cities, and you have lines connecting the dots, the interurban networks. So what about this outside? What about this broader operational landscape? This is precisely what we're interested in. And again, let me emphasize at the outset, it's not to say that agglomerations and cities don't matter. The claim that I'm developing in this work with Christian, with my colleagues in the UTL, is that we need to expand the spatial lens through which we think about the urban, so that it includes precisely the relationship between cities and agglomeration processes and these broader operational landscapes. That's the agenda. And just to fine-tune this point even more, this is the cover of our book, Implosions, Explosions, Towards a Study of Planetary Urbanization, which synthesizes some of the methodological and cartographic tools that we're using in this project. I'm not sure if anyone recognizes what this image is, but it's intended as a fairly strong, even aggressive provocation for thinking the urban question. Most books on urban questions have images of dense urban built environments and skyscrapers as the iconic representation of the urban. And we're basically turning that upside down. This is the tar sands in northern Alberta, Canada. It's actually close to a pretty big city, Fort McMurray. But it's obviously not a city by any reasonable definition of the term city. But it is, we would argue, for reasons I'm going to develop tonight, an urban landscape. It's a highly industrialized, incredibly destructive in both social and environmental terms landscape. And for us, this kind of landscape is as iconic a representation of our urban condition as any image of a big city in the world, be it Melbourne, be it Singapore, be it any other large megacity on this planet. So it's not just about thinking about new mappings of the urban in terms of digital technologies and geospatial data. This is an image by the environmental activist and photographer Garth Lenz, a wonderful Canadian photographer who's very interested in the effects of urbanization on the planet. So it's intended as a kind of strong provocation. Okay, so far so good. So that's the big picture of this project, kind of a rapid fire overview of what we're up to and hopefully a little bit about why we're doing it. So let me now ground this and unfold it in a little more detail with reference to one among several of our research strands. So I mentioned earlier that one of our agendas is to critically interrogate contemporary global urban discourse. Now, in contemporary capitalism, we are very frequently confronted with different versions of the proposition that cities have become essential to the fate of human beings on planet Earth. I'm sympathetic to that proposition. There are many different versions of that proposition and so that increasingly discussions about the future of capitalism, the future of society, the future of the environment increasingly focus on cities and on the urban as a strategic focal point for matters of collective human concern. So there's kind of, I would call this a global urban discourse. It's a discourse about the urban, but situating the urban in a global context in relation to problems of great human consequence. So there are many different strands of this. Several of these are critically interrogated by Brendan Gleeson in his latest book, Global Cities, Globalization. Creative cities and creative economies. The whole question of competitiveness is often defined in terms of cities and territories. The question of governance and good governance. Questions about citizenship actually should be added to this, are often now connected with cities. Questions about environmental sustainability. Ecological urbanism, sustainable design, extremely important questions for all of us in the design world, are connected with cities. And many of these strands in different ways connect up with a kind of meta-discourse around the urban age. The proposition that we're all confronted with in some ways repeatedly in the media, in social science, and in design discourse, that more than 50% of the world's population now lives within cities. Hence, we live in an urban age. So I think people are familiar with this proposition. I frequently see it in articles that I read and review, sometimes in dissertation proposals, master's theses, all kinds of documents that cross my inbox and my desk, this 50% threshold. And it's become so kind of taken for granted. We hear this urban age concept that it's almost like we're ready for it. Anytime we hear a lecture or read something about urban questions, you're almost ready for that move, the 50% threshold, which is in part a rhetorical device to emphasize something that I would actually also want to emphasize, namely, we live in a world in which cities are pretty important to global political, economic, environmental conditions. But just to give a little more momentum to my concern with this, let me just give you a quick tour of a few very prominent examples of this urban age discourse from across the political and intellectual spectrum. So I'll start with Rem Koolhaas from some time ago in his Mutations book. In one of the opening pages, he refers to this proposition from, of course, the United Nations, that at the outset of the 20th century, 10% lived within cities, and around 2000, 50%. So Rem Koolhaas uses it. The Urban Age Project, organized by friends and colleagues of mine at the LSE, also frames a lot of their research and public discourse around this 50% proposition. So this is a quote from one of their texts. Given that more than half the world's population is now living in cities, a number that is likely to reach 75% by 2050, this all comes from the UN, while it was only 10% in 1900, urban questions have become truly global ones with significant consequences for the future of our planet. So there are hundreds, literally, of versions of that proposition that we encounter. This is already a few years ago. And this is, again, a familiar book on many of our shelves, a very fascinating book, in fact, that goes far beyond this 50% threshold argument in many of its chapters, but which nonetheless, as a graphic design device on the cover, this is from the LSE Urban Age series, uses this 50% datum as a way to explicate the importance of their particular project. It's a framing device. Manuel Castells, so many, many different orientations on the urban age, again, some years ago, writes, our blue planet is fast becoming a predominantly urban world. Probably around the time you are reading this book, we will be crossing the threshold of 50% of the world's population living in urban areas, up from, and they're, plug in any number of different estimations from 1970. Castells chooses 37%. The forces behind this process of accelerated urbanization appear to be irreversible. We can debate about that, but that's Castells' proposition from over a decade ago. No less a critical urban theorist than Mike Davis uses the same formulation on one of the opening pages of his fundamental book, Planet of Slums. The exact, again, a representation of this threshold that we've all crossed. The exact event is unimportant, and it will pass entirely unnoticed. Nonetheless, it will constitute a watershed in human history. For the first time, the urban population of the world will outnumber the rural. Cities have absorbed nearly 2/3 of the global population explosion since 1950. The global countryside, meanwhile, has reached its maximum population and will begin to shrink. As a result, cities will account for virtually all future world population growth. So many versions of this. A lot of it, as I already mentioned, is derived from the UN's data tables. So the latest World Urbanization Prospects from 2012 basically summarizes a lot of the work that they've been doing for quite some time as follows. It's a data table in which you have two choices for classifying populations. It's either urban or it's rural by world region. So the white is the rural and the dark is the urban. And in their World Urbanization Prospects, they have this map, which talk about in more detail in a moment in terms of the legacies behind this map. But basically, national territories are color-coded according to the percent urban. And then you have a little bit extra information here because you've got the locations of cities color-coded according to population size. There are some other maps out there, such as this one from The Guardian, which offer a little bit more information, but still the basic urban age logic prevails. Countries are color-coded according to the percent urban, and this map also usefully adds some data on the actual size or estimated size of major cities around the world. But it's still basically, even though it looks more complex than the previous map, it's basically analytically identical. There's an urban-rural divide, and a color-coding scheme has been used in order to classify the urbanization level. So the question that I want to pose, in a way, is an intellectual springboard into explaining and motivating the project that we're engaged in the Urban Theory Lab and in our exhibition, is whether this urban age proposition represents a kind of global urban ideology, a global urban spatial ideology. It's become a doxic, taken for granted, imaginary reference point for understanding and also for mapping the contemporary global urban condition. I think it requires further interrogation and analysis, and as I'll argue in the next few minutes, I actually have come to the point where I think this proposition about the 50% urban threshold is more misleading than it is revealing. So it's not just a little bit fuzzy and we should tighten it up. I actually think we should throw it out. So a fairly strong, a little polemical position here, but let me try to explain why I've come to that view and what the alternative is that I have in mind. The argument of this urban age perspective basically equates the situation of us living in a world of cities, whatever we mean by cities has still to be interrogated, with an urban planet. So it uses information and data demonstrating that more and more people live within cities as a way to make a broader argument about the urban character of the planet. I do think we live increasingly in an urban planet, or I would say an urbanized and urbanizing planet. But I don't think that evidence simply about the conditions of cities and the number of people living within cities, whatever we mean by cities, is an adequate basis for explicating what the nature of that urban planet is. Okay, so that's where I'm going to go with all this. So let me say one other thing about this kind of critique that I'm going to develop. So it is a claim that the urban age notion is ideological. And there's a lot that one could say about ideology and different theories of ideology. As a critical social theorist, I'm really interested in such debates. I won't subject you to a long discourse about ideology theory and what the Germans call Ideologie Kritik, the critique of ideology. But permit me a few remarks about what this kind of critique is meant to accomplish. So for me, ideological discourse is not false consciousness. I'm not saying that the urban age concept or any other spatial ideology is simply an illusion. It's grounded in real conditions and the ongoing search to understand a rapidly changing world. So even as we critique this or any other ideological framework, we need equally to pay attention to the conditions that generated the plausibility, the intelligibility of that particular framework. So this is very, very important. We need to unpack the content of spatial ideologies, not just the urban age concept, for clues into the nature of what's going on in the world. So the critique of ideology, for me, becomes a springboard into precisely the project of the Urban Theory Lab, the attempt to find new concepts. And I couldn't resist. It seems impossible for me to give any lecture on this stuff without getting into a little bit of Lefebvre. I'm really inspired by a lot of Henri Lefebvre's work. So on this theme of space and ideology, Lefebvre is actually very useful as an intellectual guide. So Lefebvre, in 1976, very interesting essay that me and Stuart Eldon, who's in the audience, translated, Reflections on the Politics of Space, says the following. Space is not a scientific object removed from ideology or politics. It has always been political and strategic. So all these maps, all these representations, they're not neutral, they're strategic, they're political. This is the important part for me. If space has an air of neutrality and indifference, in other words, if it looks objective and neutral, it is precisely because this space has already been occupied and planned, was already the focus of past strategies of which we cannot always find traces. Space is political and ideological. It is a product literally populated with ideologies. So for me, building on this kind of orientation, precisely representations of space, whether they're geospatial, whether they're produced by the UN, whether they're produced by planners and designers, whether they're produced by critical spatial theorists such as myself, they're never neutral. They're always mediated through strategic agendas, ideological agendas. The goal is to make those agendas explicit as a way to understand the positionality of those particular representations. Okay. So what I want to do is 4 steps. So I do want to talk about the exhibition, but there's a lot of back kind of tilling the soil and preparing the ground to explain why we did what we did in the exhibition. So a little bit of genealogical background on urban age discourse. Again, I'm using that as a kind of springboard, the critique of that discourse, into explaining what we're up to. I'll elaborate my critique, again, building on work with Christian Schmid, and then I'll lay out our alternative framework in a bit more detail, and then the exhibition becomes intelligible precisely in the context of that. So all of this in the next 40 minutes. So I would say fasten your seatbelt, but I'm not planning to rush, but it's several steps in the journey that we're about to go on based on this setup. So first of all, the genealogy. So Christian and myself, in thinking about this, we took the time to actually look at the history of attempts to measure the world's urban population, both as a technical exercise, in other words, how do you find the data across all different places on city populations, but also as an epistemological exercise. There are all kinds of questions that are raised by the attempt to measure the world's urban population, the foremost of which is, what is the urban? What population level, within what boundaries, are you actually measuring? Fundamental problem. It's never been solved. I don't think it ever can be solved. But let's look at the history of it. It turns out that the attempt to measure the urban population of the entire world begins after World War II. There were many important attempts among critical and mainstream demographers prior to World War II to measure the urban populations of individual countries. So some classic works of demography devoted to that endeavor. But it was only after World War II that Kingsley Davis and some of his colleagues at Columbia and later at Berkeley attempted to develop a metric for measuring the world's urban population. So Kingsley Davis, quite a fascinating character, sociologist, demographer, urbanist, and he attempts to do this. And there are many interesting aspects of it, but the most important aspect of it, for my purposes tonight, is the definition that he gives of urbanization. This definition is from the 1940s, and I would submit to you that this is still the dominant definition of urbanization that is presupposed across the design disciplines, the planning disciplines, and the social sciences around the world. So it is a strong assumption that's become so taken for granted that we often don't recognize it as such. So what is this assumption? So, all right, I've got to see it from my computer. I can't look up that high from up here. So basically, he defines urbanization. This is from 1955, but he developed the definition a bit earlier. It's a situation in which a substantial portion of the population lives in towns and cities. So U is urbanization. P with the C under it is the population of cities. And P with the T under it is the total population. So it's a simple statistical measure. You measure the populations of cities, and you put that above it's in proportion, it's in relation to the total population of a territory, a national territory. So urbanization rates in this model depend on absolute national population size. So fundamental for this understanding, and again, as I'll argue, it persists up to this day, the framework, the territorial framework in terms of which urbanization is defined is the national territory. So the population of cities relative to total national population. This is, in effect, the formula for urbanization that Kingsley Davis developed. So very interestingly, what we found out when we started this inquiry, again, motivated by a kind of critical interrogation of contemporary urban age discourse, was that in 1955 and again in 1965, Kingsley Davis was already postulating this urban transition that we've supposedly moved through. He writes, "The human species is moving rapidly in the direction of an almost exclusively urban existence." And amazing, actually, he says, at the 1950 to 60 rate, the term urbanized world will be applicable well before the end of the century. So if you follow the UN, he missed it by a couple of years. It happened in 2007. But pretty remarkable that this guy said this in 1965 based on his calculations at that time. So in some of his collaborations on Latin America and South Asia, he started to measure national urbanization rates. And a lot of his concern, understandably enough, as a demographer, was to find comparable data sets, because different national censuses define the urban in different ways. So Kingsley Davis was a very pragmatic sociologist. He was very well aware of many of the theoretical issues that I'm going to be elaborating upon here. He was very well aware. But he didn't want to get bogged down in that stuff because he wanted to develop a global data set on urban population. So he adopted a pretty pragmatic approach, which I think, given his concerns, was entirely justified. He said, look, let's come up with two urban population thresholds that seem plausible in our particular temporal moment. And let's see what we can do. Let's see what emerges in our data based on those urban population thresholds. So it's interesting from our point of view today, given the massive size of urban populations in many megacities of the world, but the thresholds that Kingsley Davis chose, 20,000 and 100,000, and that's what's represented. Actually, yeah, the top one is 100,000, and the lower one is 20,000. And then a lot of the work that he and his colleagues did at Columbia and then later at Berkeley was deal with very tricky technical problems related to measuring the number of people in every country in the world that lived within settlements that were either 20,000 or 100,000 people. They accepted administrative boundaries. They didn't obviously they didn't have satellite data and other sources of information. They had to rely on the census, and they engaged in a lot of work to generate comparable data sets. This was highly influential. This is a diagram from, I believe, Doxiadis, where you see kind of, it's the time in which there's a lot of speculation within the UN and elsewhere about the global population explosion. So urban population, well, world population is exploding. We've got this kind of, world historical time frame from ancient times all the way up to the present, from prehistoric times all the way up to the present. And urbanization is this singular megatrend that's kind of bulldozing its way through history. Population growth, and then there's a spike. Urban population grows as well. There are a few other visualizations of this which I actually have a lot to say about, but I'll just make a few brief remarks. This one is actually from the Chicago School real estate economist that some of you may be familiar with, a fascinating character named Homer Hoyt, who, excuse me, one second. Sometime in the 60s wrote a piece on the world urban population in which he didn't cite Kingsley Davis, but basically used his data to generate this map. It's pretty similar to the ones I showed earlier from the UN, in which urbanization rates are understood basically as national metrics. It's the population within cities relative to the population within territories. He expands it to a continental level. So he has different global regions, Oceania, and so forth. But basically, it's simply a spatialization of the exact method that Kingsley Davis was using. Another Chicago intellectual, in this case geographer, Brian Barry, from the same time period, generated this visualization. It's basically the same analytic. It's the same epistemology, different spatialization. In this context, different countries are given a kind of symbolic key or a symbolic code which corresponds to their level of urbanization. Again, urbanization as the population of cities relative to the population of the territory. So in 1969, the United Nations begins among several research departments to develop an analysis of the world's, not just population, but the world's urban population. And they generate this map, which is basically epistemologically identical to the ones I just showed you from Homer Hoyt and Brian Barry. Again, urbanization as a property of national territories, which refers to the population of cities relative to the population of territories, and basically locking in this case, the Kingsley Davis methods. There are a couple of other speculations from the same time period about world urbanization. This one is actually from the Regional Plan Association of New York City. They're not using any geospatial data. It's from the late 60s, but they're trying to, instead of just use population size, they're trying to use population density. So they use the Doxiadis, the Fuller Dymaxion map, and then they start to map population density in a much more complex way, and urbanization patterns in a more complex way, although there's still plenty of empty space on this map. But this earlier one from the UN is basically the model that kind of gets locked in. And all of this leads in the 1980s and subsequently to a kind of urban age ideology, I think it's fair to say. So the UN anticipates it in the 1980s. The universalization of urbanism is a new fact. Before the year 2000, for the first time in the history of humanity, the world will have more town dwellers than country dwellers. This demographic and urban evolution is taking place in the context of economic crisis and other trends. So again, you could compile a very large book of quotations that basically say the same thing. You've already heard like 10 different versions of it tonight in many, many different ways. Subsequent consolidation in the world urbanization prospects by the UN, slight modifications of Kingsley Davis's methods, but continued use of population thresholds and the urban-rural dichotomy as a way to understand world spatial transformation. The urban transition is confirmed, it's anticipated and then confirmed by the UN in a number of its publications related to the urbanization prospects and the Department of Economic and Social Development. So this map is one other spatialization of it where you see countries given bubble sizes that correspond to urbanization rates, and then again the maps that I showed you earlier which lock in this urban-rural divide. And here's the most recent map from 2012. And just to summarize it all, so a critical demographer named Hugo Champion sort of summarizes the kind of issue that's on the table for us looking at all of this data and this history, this genealogy of attempts to define the world's urban population. The world's major source of published international comparative statistics on urban population, the United Nations, is still using the same spectacles as it adopted nearly half-century ago. So again, each of these maps, whatever their graphic design differences, is epistemologically identical. It's using this notion of urbanization is the population of cities relative to the population of national territories, and then generalizing that to a spatial representation on a world scale. And it's that set of operations, both empirical and theoretical, that underpins this kind of dramatic proclamation about the urban age. Okay, so what are the problems with this? So I have a strong critique of it, and there are two different axes of the critique. The first axis, whether you agree or disagree with some of the theoretical positions that I'm going to be developing, the first axis is empirical. There are some serious empirical issues with any declaration that we live in a world in which more than 50% of the world's population lives within cities. So let me start with those, and then I'll open up some theoretical problems. So first of all, there's the question of the urban population threshold. Different national census bureaus define the population threshold that is required in order to demarcate a place as urban in different ways. So there are a lot of different population thresholds that are used to demarcate the urban, but in many places there's the continued use of the earlier ones that were kind of arbitrarily, pragmatically chosen by Kingsley Davis, 100,000 and 20,000. There's no theoretical justification for this. It's basically a methodological placeholder, as I explained earlier, for elaborate data collection and calculations. The problem of the urban population threshold arguably persists to this day. As I'll explain in a moment, there are a whole range of different criteria that are used by national census bureaus to define the urban, but there's still the question of, to the degree that an urban population threshold is chosen, why should it be 100,000 instead of 1 million? Why should it be 1 million instead of 500,000? If you use that population threshold, that implies that there is a qualitative break. If you say it's 100,000, that implies there's a qualitative break between places that have 99,999 people and 101,010 people, for example. What is that break? What is that threshold? So if you're going to specify it in, as a threshold, one needs a justification for it. The criteria of urban settlement vary and diverge quite wildly across countries. So again, the UN continues to rely on national census bureaus for all of its estimations in the world urbanization prospects. We can have a discussion about why they do that, and is there a different way to measure urban population levels. That's something I'm very interested in, and I think that it would be very productive for the UN to mobilize resources to that endeavor. But for the moment, the UN continues to rely on the wildly divergent criteria that are used by national census bureaus. This leads to some very bizarre forms of data. So depending on whether an urban population threshold of 2,500 or 15,000 is used, Mexico is 74% or 67% urban 16 years ago or 15 years ago. So you change the UPT, the urban population threshold, national urbanization levels move around. It gets even more extreme. just on empirical terms. China is 24%, 31%, or 73% urban in 1999, depending on which of 3 urban designations is used. And as many of you know, the Chinese government very frequently changes its urban designations. It's a geopolitical and a political category. So to the degree that those designations change by national governmental fiat, the urbanization rate of the territory of the country changes. If a place like China, a place like India, a place like Brazil, a country like Indonesia, any country with a very large population, changes its designation, the world's urban population level changes. So these are serious problems, not just on a national level, but on a global aggregate level. And there are many other examples in the literature, the critical demography literature, from Egypt, Pakistan, and many other countries. So as David Satterthwaite says, a critical urban development scholar and critical demographer, the scale of the world's urban population is strongly influenced by the urban criteria used within the most populous of nations. If the Indian or Chinese government chose to change the urban criteria in their censuses, this could increase or decrease the world's level of urbanization by several percentage points. Serious problems. And let me give you, many other empirical examples could be enumerated, but let me just give you one other one which I hope will destabilize your confidence in the 50% notion just on empirical grounds. The case of India. So this is from the 2011 census. The Indian government defines the urban as minimum population 5,000. We can have a long debate about why 5,000 instead of some other criteria. The second one is remarkable. It's an economic and gender criteria, and 75% male non-agricultural employment. And then they have a density criterion. Why? Why 75% male non-agricultural employment? Why male and why non-agricultural? Many, many questions could be raised about that criterion. And let me just give one set of piece of evidence that at least suggests this is deeply misleading. So this is a geospatial image which shows the large population centers of India. It's been cleaned up quite a bit in order to demarcate the boundaries between the settlements. This is an image that shows ambient population density. So it's a more complex algorithm for showing where people move during the course of a working day. So look at the Ganges Plain. Look at the Ganges Plain, so the kind of very large dark area on the top of the map. If you were a Martian and you were looking at human settlement space and you looked at this map, you would think that it were, the biggest settlement or one of the biggest settlements on the entire planet. According to the Indian census, because that is a predominantly agricultural zone, it's rural. So some very odd consequences emerge from that. If you classify the Ganges Plain as urban, the urban percentage level of India massively escalates, and that also means the urban population of the world starts to go up. And you can add other geospatial representations to destabilize that. This is of connectivity infrastructures, which is an important part of our approach to urbanization in the Urban Theory Lab, which again suggests a much more thickly urbanized space than the initial diagram and the Indian Census Bureau's indicators suggest. So that's one of many examples we could give. But at minimum, in empirical terms, even if you believe that the endeavor of measuring urban population levels, be it nationally or globally, is fundamental, we need a different way to do it. And actually, we have geospatial techniques and other techniques available to do this a lot better than the incredibly, almost shockingly arbitrary set of criteria that are used in the data tables that continue to be used by major global organizations from the UN to the WHO and the World Bank. So just in empirical terms, serious problem. And it's actually quite shocking from my point of view, just as a social scientist, given the incredible incoherence of the empirical foundations of this proposition, that we can all so sort of calmly take it for granted that we've crossed the threshold. Like, I really have some serious doubts. But unfortunately, that's not the only problem that we confront with this urban age discourse. That's just the empirical side of the equation. Obviously, for reasons that I hope are clear at this point, given my interest in urban theory, the theoretical problems are, for me, just as fundamental, if not even more fundamental. So, and maybe you can already predict, hopefully you can, based on some of the remarks I've been making already, about what some of those theoretical problems are. First of all, and perhaps most fundamentally, what is the theoretical definition of the city and of the urban? Again and again, this settlement type is mentioned as a fundamental feature of social life, the nature of which, the population of which we have to measure. But why? And what exactly is it? It's completely underspecified, or it's specified in fairly arbitrary terms, such as the ones that I just shared from India. What is the difference that's being presupposed here between those urban zones and the non-urban zones from which they're separated? We can only answer that question in theoretical terms. No matter how much data you have, you need to have an argument about what the specificity of that space is. And that argument is very rarely offered in these discussions. Secondly, just as importantly for our work in the Urban Theory Lab, what is the status of the outside, of the non-urban, the rural? So again, as I've shown, the urban-rural divide is presupposed, repeated, naturalized in all these different discourses. But what is that non-urban? Is it really so separate from the urban conditions whose populations are being measured? What is the specificity, furthermore, of places that, in the terms of the urban age discourse, have small populations? It's very rarely specified, and again, can we really presuppose that they're outside of and disconnected from urban conditions? And finally, what is the status of the threshold? In the rhetoric of the urban age, the crossing of this threshold is emphasized again and again and again as a fundamental divide that changes our character as a species on planet Earth. But what is that threshold, and why, like, what is it about the 50%? That's a quantitative indicator, and it's being invoked again and again to demarcate a qualitative change. I'm interested in the qualitative change. I want to know what it is. But I'm not getting much illumination on that from the reference to the purely quantitative indicator. Maybe there is a threshold, and maybe it does signal a qualitative change, but we need to specify what it is. So there are a number of blind fields within this discourse, which it seems to me we fundamentally need to overcome in order to develop a more adequate approach to contemporary urbanization. So now I come to the part of the critique of ideology, which is precisely a springboard into an alternative conceptualization. So first of all, the settlement fetishism of the discourse. The assumption that all spaces across the world are differentiated among distinct settlement types, which are universally replicated across territories and places. Secondly, the urban-rural opposition, which I've already been saying quite a bit about. You have a choice in this discourse. You have to classify all space, and you have a choice. It's either urban or it's rural. So that's already a very strong theoretical claim, which many of us would take exception to. And finally, a distributional model of urban transition. So the notion of the threshold, to the degree that it's specified, is specified in distributional terms. The way I think of it is like an hourglass. And during the course of human history, most of the world's population is in one part of the hourglass, the rural. And gradually it trickles down. There's more sand being added to the hourglass, of course, to the degree that global population is rising. But basically, it's just being distributed. More people move from the rural into the urban. So each of those are blind fields, and to the degree that we take issue with those assumptions, it's very easy to sympathize with my friend Batman, who gets so frustrated with global urban ideologies that he slaps his other friend, I guess that's Robin. So obviously I wouldn't go that far, but it's easy, like, given this sort of intellectual excavation that we've done of some of the underlying assumptions that are at play anytime anyone declares that we live in an urban world because more than 50% of the world's population lives within cities, it's easy to have a kind of, even a little bit of an aggressive or perhaps just frustrated reaction. So in the time remaining, I am going to try to do a couple of different things. So there are a number of different possible escape routes out of this set of urban discourses. One escape route is to continue to try to measure the world's urban population, but to try to develop more statistically adequate approaches that circumvent some of the problems that I've demarcated. The field of critical demography is a fascinating field. I've learned quite a lot about it in the course of doing this research, and one can have a debate about whether that's the best way forward, but it's an extremely interesting endeavor, and one that I hope the United Nations and other global organizations that collect data will pay attention to. A second and related escape route is to use geospatial data. So obviously, as I think you all will know, we have incredibly and increasingly sophisticated sources of geospatial data on population size, distribution, density, and many other land use and land cover conditions. And this geospatial data can be mobilized to generate radically different maps of urban space and urbanization processes. So if you look at the work of someone like Shlomo Angel, who's been working with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to try to come up with new indicators of urban boundaries, it's extremely interesting. And I've had some interesting debates with Professor Angel about some of these agendas. It's a different strategy than the one that we've adopted. But it's certainly quite sophisticated because he's using the full spectrum of geospatial data based on some very clearly defined indicators across territories around the world in order to come up with a different way of bounding the urban condition than the standard demographic approaches use. So I have a lot of respect for that approach, even though it has very different implications and very different cartographic ramifications than the work that we're actually doing. Third escape route, and this, it won't surprise you, is the one that we've adopted in the Urban Theory Lab, is to explode the theoretical categories entirely and to try to invent new conceptual mappings of the urban condition. So that's where we're going. So according to my watch, I've been talking for about 53, 54 minutes. And so I don't want to crash land this jumbo jet that I've been flying here, but I need to land it. And there's another step in my argument. So the question and the hope is that you'll grant me another 5-ish minutes the goal would be this. Permit me to simply explain the alternative cartography in very brief terms. I'm going to skip a bunch of slides. And then on that basis, I'll just quickly introduce the exhibition and hopefully motivate you to have a look at the work that we've been doing. So you've all been very patiently listening to my critique, but I can't leave you just with the critique. I need to try to explain the ways in which it flows into hopefully a constructive research agenda. So is that okay? Like another hang in there for a few more minutes here? I'm not going to nosedive it, but it's going to be a kind of steep descent to the runway, which hopefully still gets the core message across. So yeah, let me just rapid fire. Here's a bunch of stuff. Lefebvre. It's just like lecture 2. OK. So our work on planetary urbanization is an attempt to develop a different epistemology for thinking the urban question. I want to emphasize that the notion of planetary urbanization that we're using and that is presupposed in the exhibition, it's not a concept which says that the whole world is becoming homogenized and every space is being urbanized in the same way. It's fundamentally a concept of uneven spatial development and spatial inequality. So in a way, the notion of planetary urbanization refers less, at least at this stage of our work, to a specific mapping of the world than to a method for trying to map the world. And the core of that method can be summarized in a couple quick steps. So number one, the urban is not a unit. We're completely throwing out the notion of the urban as a settlement type. It's a process. It's a process of sociospatial transformation mediated through capitalist forms of industrialization. Second, there are many urbanization processes. There's no single morphology of the urban. Again and again, social scientists, planners, and geographers have tried to define the morphology of the urban that's characteristic of a particular time and place. We don't think that's productive. In other words, you can do that, but the definitional lock-in of that form, of that morphology as the essential form, we don't think makes sense. It's not as productive as simply conceding there are many different patterns and pathways of urbanization. Let's look at what they are in different world regions and different historical geographical moments. And thirdly, we want to supersede the urban-non-urban divide that has long been presupposed and naturalized in urban theory and in many of the design and planning disciplines. So again, by saying that everything is becoming urban, we're not saying everything is becoming the same, but we're saying that there's a process of urbanization that is transforming in place and territory specific ways many different parts of the world. And it's more productive to analyze that by looking at a kind of worldwide urban fabric and the connections of different places and the positionalities of different places within that worldwide urban fabric, rather than using this classificatory tool, urban versus non-urban. So the one conceptual distinction that I need to just quickly introduce, which also will help explain what we're up to in the exhibition, is the distinction between concentrated and extended urbanization. So, and again, I'll be very concise. So, in fact, I'm not even going to use my slide. I'm just going to summarize it because time is short. So, in a nutshell, our argument is this. Most of urban theory has focused on concentrated urbanization, the moment of agglomeration, the moment of concentration. This is fundamental. It remains fundamental for our work. But we're adding to the emphasis on concentrated urbanization an equivalent emphasis on what we call extended urbanization. So for us, urbanization, in contrast to the Kingsley-Davis model, the population of cities relative to the population of territories, it's a dialectic between concentrated and extended urbanization. Concentrated urbanization is that moment of agglomeration and centralization. Extended urbanization is the transformation of society, territory, and environment precisely in support of agglomeration. So in other words, what we often think of as the hinterland in this framework is now internalized as part of urbanization. So if you think back to the image of the tar sands that I put up, quite a while ago at this point, a zone of intensive industrial resource extraction for us is urbanized to the degree that that resource extraction is mobilized in support of urban growth elsewhere. So this opens up a set of questions about spaces that we normally think of as being rural or wilderness or non-urban, and instead of classifying them in that way, we're now forced to look at their connections to and their embeddedness within a worldwide urban fabric. So again, I'm going to skip my representations of concentrated urbanization because I think that's more familiar, but let me just share with you a few of extended urbanization. So coal mining districts in northern England during the Industrial Revolution, and in the United States during the Industrial Revolution, for us, those are part of the urban fabric that's emerging under 19th and early 20th century capitalism. Zones of resource extraction around the world, certainly in Australia, become part of the urban fabric. So the urban landscape of Australia, for us, is not simply the big cities along the coastline. It's the broader set of social, environmental, territorial transformations across the entire territory, which fuel and support urbanization, not only in Australia, but in other zones of the world economy. So these are just very simple maps, but they open up a problematique about the urban fabric of, in this case, Australia, that go far beyond the traditional emphasis on the big cities and city regions. We can look at water infrastructures. We can look at transportation infrastructures. This is a wonderful 19th century statistical cartographer named Minard, who's mapping the connectivity infrastructures of 19th century Europe via rail, commodity flows, telegraph wires, undersea cables. So the oceans, as you'll see also in our exhibition, become part of the urban fabric both in the early 20th century and in the contemporary period of the internet age. So increasingly large-scale continental infrastructures of transportation, connectivity, and commodity flow become central elements in the urban fabric. Much could be said about some of these different visualizations, but hopefully the point is clear. It opens up the question of a very large-scale fabric of urbanization. And for us, it goes not only into the oceans and down into the underground where resource extraction occurs, but also up into the atmosphere. There's not only space junk, but the various coordination devices associated with satellites. Final set of comments, and I promise you, stop the exhibition. So just a couple sentences. So hopefully it's clear how we're trying to reinvent our theoretical approach to urbanization. The project on operational landscapes is a speculative attempt to subject this theory of concentrated and extended urbanization to extreme stress. It would be easy using that theory to look at the nighttime lights map and choose some very large-scale zones where there are a lot of nighttime lights and therefore presumably a lot of infrastructure, and start to define new urban landscapes. So the Ganges Plain, which I mentioned before, the Nile River is an incredible urban space. If you look at the Nile River, it looks like an incredibly large linear city, which is kind of what it is. So many different research designs and also questions of practice can emerge at very large scales from this kind of agenda. But in our work, we wanted to go further than that and see if the theory could prove useful in the face of an even more extreme challenge. What's most remarkable about this famous nighttime lights map for us is the emptiness of much of the world. Despite the claim that the whole world is becoming urban, most of this map is basically blank. The Amazon, the oceans, the Sahara, the Arctic, the Gobi Desert, the Himalayas, etc. So we decided to look at those zones and to see whether, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, they've been more tightly integrated into the world urban fabric. So on the far left are nighttime lights visualizations. I forgot to mention Siberia. So Siberia, the Sahara, the Pacific, the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert Steppe, the Arctic, and the Amazon. A couple other very important visualizations that are often used to measure or map global land cover. The last of the wild data set from the World Wildlife Foundation, among others, and a very interesting data set from the Anthropocene literature on the Anthropocenic biomes. What's fundamental about each of these maps is the emptiness of those spaces. They look devoid of human impact and devoid of any kind of infrastructure of any kind. So in our work during the last 2.5 years, we've basically begun to look at those territories. Using our framework, thinking about urbanization in terms of land use intensification, connectivity infrastructure, and socio-environmental transformation, and as mediated through a dialectic between, as explained a moment ago, concentrated and extended urbanization. What you'll see in the exhibition is a series of counter-visualizations, which very quickly fill up these supposedly empty, dehumanized spaces with any number of imprints of global industrialization and, in our terms, global urbanization. So I'll just conclude my remarks actually without saying anything else, but just sharing with you a few of the very provocative visualizations that the members of the Urban Theory Lab have generated, trying to use this framework as a way to think about the urban fabric in a much more extensive way than the mainstream approach. So the Arctic from Gurga Basic, the Amazon, Danny Ibanez, Ali Fard, several others, actually including James Whitten, who has connections to Melbourne. The ocean, Pacific Ocean, Matthew Brown. So what looks like an empty space is suddenly quite filled. And the Sahara, Tamer El Shayal, Marianne Potvin, Danny Ibanez, and others examining some of the industrial resource extraction infrastructures as well as the political geographies of the Arctic. So I very much thank you for your incredible patience listening to this elaborate theoretical critique and shorter version of a counter-proposal. And I very much hope you'll have a look at our work, both on our website and above all in the exhibition. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much for a fascinating tour de force. You said you landed all of us on 3 wheels or appropriate numbers very effectively. You've taken us through a complete deconstruction of the framing of this idea of the urban threshold and demonstrated to us there are many powerful ways to reconceptualize it, moving away from that doxic reference point you talked about. So thank you very much for this. I'm just going to wrap up fairly quickly by saying what Robin might have said. Holy smokes, Neil. What an astonishing tour de force. You've given us ways to escape definitions, to duck the dangers, and to re-emerge with I think, a new look as to what we understand to be the urban. The exhibition upstairs is a very powerful rendering of that, and having heard this theoretical framing of it, I can now go back and understand far more clearly what it is you've been explaining there. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. And please, if you're free on Friday from 3 to 5 for the salon, I'll be hanging out in there, and then we can continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone.